In the winter of 1938, New York City was a symphony of possibility and deep, churning shadow. Yet for the city's elite, the shadows were taking on a horrifyingly personal dimension. Imagine, Upper East Side, a mansion cloaked in wealth, now suffocating under a blanket of spectral dread. The victim, the notorious financier Silas Thorne, was found frozen, his face a mask of terror, a single crimson stain blooming over his heart. Before his death, Silas whispered of her, a woman scorned, a phantom draped in the color of rage, the lady in red. This wasn't a case for the NYPD. It was a desperate plea for a different kind of detective, a man who navigated the razor's edge between the living and the dead. The air in that mansion is heavy with cheap perfume and expensive fear. Are you ready to step into 1938 and witness the terrifying vengeance of a heartbroken ghost? The year is 1938. The relentless hum of New York City is a backdrop to a growing epidemic of the unexplained. This is the world of Kane Bones, a man whose trench coat hid more than just the chilling Manhattan wind. A former academic, disillusioned with conventional science, Kane found his calling not in solving crimes, but in unraveling the paradoxes that tethered the dead to the living. He possessed an uncanny sensitivity to residual energy and an arsenal of custom-made devices, a spectral barometer, a modified magnetic coil that blended scientific pragmatism with occult theory. His latest case took him to the opulent yet now ruinous Fifth Avenue manor of the deceased Silas Thorne. The family had dismissed Silas's ravings about the lady in red as the decline of a guilty conscience, until his heart simply stopped. The client, Silas's older, stoic sister Eleanor Vance, 62, a woman whose eyes held the weary skepticism of old New York money, offered Kane an exorbitant fee. Silence the entity and restore the house's dignity. The housekeeper, the devout Martha Hayes, 55, confirmed the terror with trembling conviction, speaking of inexplicable drafts, distant, sorrowful piano music, and a suffocating scent of gardenia that wafted through the halls before Silas's demise. Kane knew this was no ordinary haunting. This was a spirit driven by a purpose, a cold, calculated revenge. Before we venture further into the echoing halls of the Thorne Manor, take a moment to secure your anchor to the living world. If this story sends a genuine chill down your spine, don't be a stranger to the silence. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for weekly doses of historical dread. And tell me, detective, in the comments below, what city and country are you tuning in from right now? I am utterly fascinated to know the global reach of these chilling investigations. Let the world know where the fear is felt most keenly.
The magnificent manor of Silas Thorne, a fortress of granite and ill-gotten wealth on the Upper East Side, was steeped in a cold that defied the central heating system. It was the chill of deep, pervasive sadness, a signature sensation Kane Bones had learned to recognize as psychic residue. Stepping across the threshold, he felt the heavy mantle of the past settle on his shoulders. The entrance hall, a testament to 19th-century excess, was now a corridor of dread. Eleanor Vance, Silas's formidable sister, greeted him with a practiced but clearly strained composure. Her diamond rings glittered under the dull chandelier light, a sharp contrast to the genuine fear in her eyes. "Mr. Bones," she repeated, "this must be handled with the utmost discretion. The details of my brother's affliction must not leave these walls." Kane nodded, pulling a small, highly sensitive Geiger counter from his satchel. It wasn't for radiation, but for anomalous energy spikes. As he moved toward the library, the counter emitted faint rhythmic clicks, faster near the floorboards. The library was Kane's starting point, the last place Silas Thorne was seen alive. The air here was almost viscous, difficult to inhale. He ran his gloved hand over the spines of the leather-bound books. He set up his etheric detector, a modified compass housed in mahogany case designed to react violently to localized disruptions of the magnetic field. The needle immediately began to gyrate erratically, pointing everywhere and nowhere, confirming the presence of a powerful, mobile entity. Martha Hayes, the longtime housekeeper, watched him from the doorway, her silhouette trembling. "It was the scent, Mr. Bones, that cheap, sickly sweet gardenia perfume. It always came first, like a funeral wreath." Kane made a note of the scent, recognizing its potential as a sensory trigger for the entity and a point of focus for his investigation. He examined the antique Persian rug where the faint crimson stain lay. He knelt, scraping a tiny sample into a vial. It was not blood, nor wine, but a pigment, the intense, almost luminous red dye used in high-quality silk. This suggested the entity was not merely an ethereal shadow, but a detailed sensory imprint of a woman in her prime, likely wearing her most significant possession. He pressed Martha further, demanding any scrap of information about the woman Silas had scorned, no matter how trivial. The spirit's rage was personal, and Kane knew that to stop the haunting, he had to understand the heart behind the horror. The Geiger counter suddenly screamed, an unnerving, continuous tone. Kane froze, looking up at the grand staircase. He felt a sudden sharp draft, and the heavy library doors slammed shut with a reverberating bang, plunging him into near total darkness, leaving only the sound of the screaming counter and the heavy, sweet, suffocating cloud of gardenia. He was no longer alone.
The slamming of the doors was a clear declaration of war from the spectral forces inhabiting the manor. Kane Bones calmly lit a match, the sudden flare momentarily breaking the paralyzing darkness. He retrieved his brass flashlight and located the door latches, which were unnervingly cold to the touch. The encounter confirmed that the entity was intelligent, willful, and deeply territorial. He had invaded the ghost's sanctuary. Martha Hayes, terrified by the commotion, later recovered and led Kane to Silas's private study, a room rarely used, where she claimed Silas kept things he didn't want the missus to know. It was here, concealed behind a loose panel in a wall safe, that Kane discovered a small, intricately carved mahogany box. The lock yielded easily to Kane's specialized tension picks. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay the key to the mystery. A sepia-toned photograph of a beautiful, fiery-haired young woman in a brilliant red satin dress, her expression radiating defiance and a touch of melancholy. Beneath the photograph, Kane found a small official-looking document, a promissory note for a mortgage on a small apartment in a less desirable part of Greenwich Village, made out to Evelyn Cross. Martha, catching a glimpse of the photo, gasped and covered her mouth. "That's her. That's the one. Evelyn Cross. He called her his little sparrow. A singer. He promised her everything, then cancelled the wedding to marry the Vandelin heiress. It was public, humiliating." Martha broke down, the fear giving way to pity. "She killed herself, Mr. Bones, in the master suite, the night before his engagement party. She did it in the bed he bought her." The details solidified the revenge narrative. This was not a spirit seeking communication. It was an entity seeking justice through terror. Kane proceeded immediately to the master suite, a lavish room now radiating the greatest concentration of spiritual cold. The room, sealed by the family since Silas's death, held a pervasive feeling of utter despair. Kane set up his spectral barometer, a glass tube filled with alcohol and microthermometers. It immediately registered a concentrated drop to -12°C, localized over a plush velvet chaise lounge. This was the entity's nexus, the spot where the trauma occurred. As Kane moved the lounge to examine the floor beneath, the floorboards emitted a faint, high-pitched creak, seemingly under invisible pressure. Under the chaise, snagged on a dust ruffle, he found it. A single red satin slipper, small, elegant, and clearly belonging to the woman in the photograph. It was a physical remnant, saturated with residual energy, a piece of the lady in red's mortal life, acting as a powerful beacon for her spectral existence. Kane carefully bagged the slipper, the act of removal causing the cold spot to momentarily dissipate, only to snap back into place seconds later, confirming the spirit's immediate and aggressive reaction to the disruption of her sacred ground. The air grew heavy, and a low resonant hum, like a distant, sustained cello note, pulsed through the room.
The retrieval of the red slipper provoked an immediate, violent response. The hum intensified into a sharp, grating vibration. As Kane Bones turned to leave the master suite, the heavy mahogany door, which he had left slightly ajar, swung inward with tremendous force, slamming into the wall and shattering the ornate plasterwork. A furious, invisible gale whipped through the room, sending curtains billowing inward and scattering Kane's documentation across the floor. It was a clear, unmistakable act of furious territorial defense. Kane stood his ground, maintaining his focus. "Your claim is noted, Evelyn," he stated calmly into the swirling chaos, his voice firm. "But this is not your resting place. It is a prison you built." That evening, Kane established his primary base of operations in the drawing room, a location strategically central to the main emotional and physical disturbances. He deployed his most complex device, the etheric resonator,
a delicate piece of apparatus combining vacuum tubes and modified radio antennas, designed to amplify and record subtle low-frequency atmospheric vibrations and convert them into audible sound. The initial output was nothing but static, the white noise of a silent house. However, as the clock struck midnight, the hour Martha Hayes claimed the disturbances were at their peak, the static began to resolve into a distinct, chilling sound. It began as a faint, sustained weeping, a sound so steeped in sorrow and betrayal that it made the hairs on Kane's arms stand erect. It was the sound of a woman beyond consolation. The weeping lasted for several minutes, slowly morphing into a rhythmic, distant sound, a piano playing a waltz. But it was no cheerful tune. The notes were slow, dragging, and full of mocking pathos, played with agonizing slowness. Martha, peering from the kitchen hallway, whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "That's the song, the Cavalier's Lament. Mr. Thorne used to play it badly for her, laughing that it described her foolish heart." The spirit was using music as a weapon, a specific, targeted instrument of psychological torture. Kane realized that the revenge was meticulously theatrical. He grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound, which was strongest near the ornate ballroom doors. The temperature drop was drastic, causing the air to mist before his face. The brass doorknobs were covered in a thin, visible layer of frost. As he reached the doors, the music abruptly stopped. A profound silence fell, a silence heavier and more terrifying than the sound itself. Kane slowly pushed the doors open. The vast, empty ballroom was bathed in the faint, silvery light of the street lamps filtering through the large windows. And then, at the far end, near the orchestra platform, he saw a momentary distortion of light and shadow, a graceful, tall silhouette in a fluid dress, a shimmering, impossibly red outline. It was only visible for a second, a flicker of crimson against the dark wood paneling, before it dissolved back into the surrounding gloom. But the evidence of her passage remained, a suffocating cloud of gardenia, so intense it burned the inside of Kane's nostrils. The lady in red was physically manifesting, drawing energy directly from the residual pain of her final, humiliating moments on that very floor.
The evidence pointed relentlessly toward a central, unaddressed grievance. Kane Bones knew that vengeful spirits rarely sought random destruction. They sought resolution or recognition. Evelyn Cross, the lady in red, was a woman whose final, desperate voice had been silenced by Silas Thorne's arrogance and wealth. The missing piece of the puzzle, Kane hypothesized, was her final testimony, the suicide note. Silas, meticulous and pathologically self-serving, would not have simply destroyed a document that might be considered scandalous. He would have neutralized it, rendered it invisible by concealing it among objects that appeared innocuous or related to their former intimacy. Armed with this theory, Kane returned to Silas Thorne's private study, focusing his attention not on safes or drawers, but on the objects of art and literature. Evelyn was an opera singer. Her passion was music. Among the library's extensive collection, Kane located a set of rare imported musical scores. He carefully examined a first-edition copy of Giuseppe Verdi's La Traviata, a tragedy about a high-society courtesan scorned by love and prejudice,
a story that painfully mirrored Evelyn's own life. The book felt oddly weighted, and the leather binding was slightly stiffer than it should be. Using a specialized UV light, Kane detected faint, almost imperceptible signs of disturbance along the inner seam of the cover. With painstaking care, using a dental pick and a jeweler's magnifying glass, Kane delicately worked on the inner cover of the score. Beneath the heavy linen lining, he located a thin, folded sheet of brittle, yellowed parchment. He gently extracted it, unfolding it with the reverence due to a sacred, terrible relic. It was indeed Evelyn Cross's final, desperate declaration, written in a rapid, almost hysterical hand, the ink slightly smeared from old tears. The letter was addressed directly to Silas. "You took my future, Silas, and extinguished my light with your avarice. Know this, my silence will not be your peace. I will haunt your prosperity until the red of my pain stains your very foundation. I will be the lady in red, and my vengeance will be eternal. You will not bury my love without consequence."
With Evelyn Cross's suicide note secured, Kane Bones began to understand the full scope of the spectral attack. The haunting was highly selective, focused primarily on the destruction of Silas Thorne's peace and legacy. However, the energy readings near Eleanor Vance's quarters were inexplicably high, suggesting a secondary target. Kane used his modified camera, fitted with a silver nitrate plate and an external battery designed for long exposure photography in high-energy fields. The resulting photographs were startling. Faint, pulsating streaks of crimson light not only emanated from the master suite, but also formed dense, chaotic spirals around Eleanor's private study door. This was Evelyn's residual emotional energy, an aftershock of fury directed squarely at the sister. Kane presented the note to Eleanor Vance, observing her reaction with clinical precision. As she read the desperate, venomous words, her rigid composure finally splintered. The color drained from her face, replaced by a ghastly pallor. I knew about her," Eleanor stammered, twisting the pearl strands around her fingers until her knuckles were white. "Silas asked me to handle it. He couldn't be bothered. I met with her at a tea room. I offered her $10,000 to disappear. I told her," Eleanor's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp, "that she was a common tramp, and that the Thorne name would never be sullied by filth from the slums." Eleanor's confession was the missing piece of the spectral puzzle. She hadn't just been an executor of Silas's will. She had been the instrument of Evelyn's final, ultimate humiliation. Evelyn Cross's vengeance, Kane realized, was a carefully stratified performance, primary retribution for Silas and a secondary yet equally intense vendetta against the representative of the elitist society that had crushed her. Eleanor, with her cutting words and social contempt, had earned the lady in red's enduring enmity. The tension in the house was now palpable. The very walls seemed to sigh. As evening approached, the temperature plummeted across the second floor.
Kane was in the hallway, adjusting his etheric resonator, when the distinct, sweet, overwhelming scent of gardenia returned, far stronger and more acrid than before. The resonator began to emit a rapid, violent series of clicks, a high-frequency energy discharge. Kane looked up. At the end of the long, dark corridor, near Eleanor Vance's study, the air began to shimmer. It was not a faint shadow this time, but a cohesive, undeniable form. A tall, graceful figure, draped in a deep, undulating red, materialized, absorbing the ambient light around her. The lady in red stood fully manifested, her face a mask of incandescent fury, her spectral eyes fixed with deadly, unwavering intent on Eleanor's study door. The floorboards beneath the entity seemed to darken, saturated with the sheer weight of her presence. She did not move towards Kane. She simply held her ground, a silent, terrifying sentinel. Kane knew that the entity was at the peak of its power and actively guarding the path to its next target. Any aggressive movement on his part would result in a potentially fatal counterstrike. He had been given a clear view of the ghost's ultimate goal, the terrorization, and perhaps the complete eradication of Eleanor Vance.
The terrifying, fully manifested presence of the lady in red solidified Kane Bones' strategy. He could not, and should not, attempt to destroy or merely banish her. He had to facilitate her release. The entity was driven by a powerful, unaddressed narrative, and Kane's only weapon was the truth contained within the suicide note. He needed to create a final theatrical stage for Evelyn Cross's overdue curtain call. The master suite, the place of her suicide, and the nucleus of the haunting was the only viable location. Kane issued precise instructions to Eleanor Vance and Martha Hayes. They were to retreat immediately to the lowest level of the house, the old coal bunker, which had been converted into a reinforced, soundproof safe room. They were absolutely forbidden from leaving, regardless of the sounds of shattering glass or spectral turmoil. Their presence was a liability, acting as a continued emotional target for the vengeful entity. In the master suite, Kane initiated his setup. First, he ordered Martha to bring the heaviest, most ornate-looking glass from the ground floor, a massive, antique gilded mirror. He placed it dead center in the room, facing the chaise lounge, recognizing the old occult theory that mirrors act as powerful focusing agents, allowing spirits to observe or be drawn into conscious awareness. Next, he set up a high-quality gramophone beside the mirror. He carefully selected a recording of Evelyn's own operatic aria from La Traviata, a rare vinyl he had sourced that morning. The music, filled with dramatic passion and soaring sorrow, was intended to appeal to the spirit's deepest, most cherished memory. Finally, he strategically placed the red satin slipper on the floor near the chaise lounge and laid Evelyn's suicide note prominently on the dark velvet cushion. The arrangement was complete. The music to lure her, the mirror to focus her, and the note to set her free. He activated the gramophone. The powerful, heartbreaking voice of a soprano filled the silent, cold room, a lament echoing with the ghost's own pain. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The intense cold solidified, and the red mist began to churn, not aggressively, but with a swirling, drawn motion, converging toward the central mirror. The lady in red was responding, her spectral essence drawn by the familiar, beloved sound and the physical tokens of her tragedy. As the aria reached its crescendo, the figure in red began to coalesce, slowly resolving into a tall, ethereal woman whose face was shrouded by the furious, sweeping shadow of her hat. She drifted across the room, her attention fixed, momentarily ignoring Kane. Her gaze fell first upon the slipper, then upon the note on the chaise lounge. This was the moment. Kane knew that the next action had to be perfectly timed to intercept her destructive rage before it was reignited.
The spectral figure of the lady in red stood inches from the chaise lounge, her translucent hand hovering over the brittle parchment of the suicide note. The reflection in the gilded mirror behind her was sharper, clearer than her actual form, a striking, terrifying image of a wronged woman on the verge of explosive, final vengeance. The intensity of her presence was almost suffocating, forcing Kane Bones to take shallow, ragged breaths. He felt the familiar emotional tidal wave, not just cold, but a burning, corrosive mix of betrayal and absolute, suicidal despair. Kane spoke, his voice authoritative but calm, cutting through the operatic drama. He was careful not to approach the chaise, maintaining a respectful distance. "Evelyn, you have your revenge on Silas. He paid his price. But the vengeance you truly seek, the vengeance of the unburdened truth, is still incomplete." The spirit turned her head, her ethereal gaze, 2 points of burning, silent resentment focusing on him. A nearby chandelier began to rattle violently, and a crack propagated swiftly across the ceiling plaster. "This is not a trap, Evelyn," Kane continued, lifting the suicide note in its archival sleeve. "This is your final stage, your voice." He began to read her final words aloud, projecting his voice to fill the echoing suite. "You took my future, Silas, and extinguished my light with your avarice." As the resonant power of the words filled the air, the spectral amplifier began to register an immediate, massive drop in the energy field. The continuous tone of the Geiger counter sputtered and died. The chandeliers ceased their rattling. He read every syllable, every desperate accusation, finishing with her promise. "I will be the lady in red, and my vengeance will be eternal. You will not bury my love without consequence." He finished the reading, his voice soft, and held the note toward the spirit. The effect was profound. The crimson radiance surrounding the lady in red began to diminish, pulling inward like smoke from a dying fire. The furious tension in her form melted away, replaced by an expression of bottomless, weary sorrow. The rage was spent. The truth was spoken. She was no longer a vengeful phantom, but a heartbroken woman finally given her moment of recognition. The figure in the mirror blurred, then shattered, not with a crash of glass, but with a silent, crystalline dissipation.
The spirit of Evelyn Cross, the lady in red, released a final, incredibly resonant sigh, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 tears. The sigh seemed to travel through the air, across the room, and out of the open window, a final farewell. Then, with a sudden complete cessation of cold, scent, and sound, she was gone. Kane stood alone, breathing deeply in the silent, now ordinary warmth of the master's suite. The vengeance had been satisfied, the narrative complete.
The absolute stillness that followed the spirit's dissipation was more definitive than any cleansing ritual. The master suite was finally and unequivocally ordinary. The heavy, perfumed oppression was lifted, and the cold had receded, leaving behind only the normal temperature of a well-heated New York home. Kane Bones meticulously dismantled his equipment, packing the etheric resonator and the now silent Geiger counter. The physical evidence, the red satin slipper, the spectral photographs, and the critical suicide note were bagged and labeled. He retrieved Eleanor Vance and Martha Hayes from the safe room. Eleanor emerged pale and shaky, but her eyes held a clarity that had been absent before. She stared at the master suite doors, no longer with fear, but with a profound, almost ashamed solemnity. Kane handed her the archival sleeve containing the note. "The haunting is over, Mrs. Vance," he stated, his voice professional and firm. Evelyn Cross was not seeking destruction, she was seeking acknowledgement. Your brother's greatest crime was the erasure of her existence. By publicly declaring her truth, the spirit's mission was complete, and she is at rest. Eleanor looked down at the parchment. She was a person, not just a scandal, she murmured, a trace of genuine regret in her voice. Kane advised her to seal the note in a memorial plaque, or better yet, to have it formally documented in the city archives, granting Evelyn the dignity in death that Silas had denied her in life. He explained that any attempt to destroy the note now might only reignite the powerful residual energy it carried. The revenge was a closed circuit, and the circuit needed to remain open to the public truth. Kane accepted the agreed-upon fee, not as payment for a cleanup, but as payment for an act of historical justice. As he prepared to leave the opulent, newly tranquil mansion, Martha Hayes approached him near the foyer. She didn't speak of fear, but of gratitude. "I finally feel like I can breathe, Mr. Bones," she said, clutching his hand. "Like the house remembers its dignity." Kane simply nodded. He knew the house's dignity was secondary to the spirit's dignity. Stepping out onto Fifth Avenue, the crisp 1938 air felt fresh and clean. The city bustled, unaware of the terrifying drama that concluded behind the granite walls. Kane Bones knew that New York City was a labyrinth of silent tragedies, and that the lady in the red was but one of 1,000 spirits demanding their untold story be heard. The case was closed, a chilling, definitive proof that in the annals of paranormal investigation, the most dangerous weapon is not a ghost's wrath, but the suppressed truth of a heart scorned. He tipped his fedora to the dawn, already contemplating the city's next desperate, chilling plea.